Let's look again at some flowers, and I'll show you some particular features as we talk about it. Look at this very typical flower here. This is probably very much like most flowers we see. You see a female part sticking up. There's the stigma and the style. You see 4 male parts around that. Those are the anthers. You also see petals, which you think of as in a typical flower, the colored parts. And also look under the petals. You see sometimes the same color, sometimes green or a different color, but you'll see sepals or a ring of sepals, and sometimes those will look very much like petals in some way. Now let's look at a cutaway view here. If we look inside behind some of the petals, we see what we talked about earlier. We see an ovary, which is again the female part of the flower, and inside the ovary are several ovules, or in this case they're about to be eggs, if you want to call it that. You could call it an ova or an ovum, but I see 3 eggs which will eventually, if fertilized, turn into 3 other individuals. And you have several choices here with flowers because, as we said, God has a symphony of different ideas when it comes to plants on planet Earth. But the one I just showed you would be called a complete flower, and that's because it has all of the 4 parts I just showed you. It has petals, sepals, anthers, and the female part or the pistil. All right, look at some other possibilities below here. You could also have 4 possible incomplete flowers. So look at the first one on the left. What's missing? Yeah, petals are missing. And that's very common in the grasses we talked about earlier, where you have what we called ugly flowers or not very attractive. They don't have petals because they don't have to be attractive enough to attract a pollinator of some sort. Okay, move to the second one. What's missing? The sepals. And you don't think about that very often, but if you turn the flower over and look, there would be petals, but there would be no sepals under the petals. Okay, look at the third one. All male parts with no female part. So in that case, that particular flower would be a unisex flower. It would be the gender male. And the last flower on the far right would be strictly a female flower. So lots of different variations on planet Earth. You could be missing any of those 4, one or more of those 4 parts, and still be considered a flower in some form. Also, we could have what's called perfect or imperfect flowers. And this is a little bit overlapping with what I just showed you, but look at the perfect flower. It has both genders in the same flower. Imperfect, though, is what we call when you only have one gender. So the one on the left, the bottom left there, that's a male flower. And the one on the right is a female flower. But once again, you could have what's called a perfect flower and have both genders in the same flower. And as we keep saying, that's a very common thing on planet Earth. So depending on the plant, and that obviously would make a difference in the way that we handle that plant or grew it in some ways. Okay, look at this. Plants also have a different way of showing those 2 genders. So you could have one plant that was just totally what we call perfect monoecious, and that plant has both genders in the same flower, or in one flower. Okay, that's the plant on the left. Look at the middle plant, though. That would be an imperfect monoecious, and that means you have 2 different genders of flowers on the same plant. So what's the difference between that and the first one? The first one has both genders in the same flower, but the second one has both genders still on the same plant, but they're in different flowers. So that would have male flowers and female flowers on the same plant. Just for the sake of you knowing, that's the way a cucumber works. So I know when my cucumbers will start producing cucumbers because they first put on male flowers, and then about a week later they start putting on both male and female flowers. Okay, you can also have plant species in which one particular plant will be totally male and the other plant would be totally female. This happens in trees like hollies and persimmons, where some people will go to the nursery and pick a tree and take it home and think, oh, I'll have fruit on this tree. Well, maybe not, because in that particular species, you may have chosen a species that is dioecious, which has that literally means two different houses. So you have two houses, one house for the male, one for the female, and you may have purchased a male plant, which will never have fruit on it because it is a male. Or you could have chosen a female plant that will never have fruit because there's not another male plant within so many miles of it for it to fertilize. We also could classify a flower by where the ovary is. So look at the first flower. Notice that the petals are below the ovary. That's where the babies would develop. That's called a superior ovary. And then the second one on the bottom is called an inferior ovary. That's where the ovary is below the petals and usually the sepals. One more thing, we could talk about the symmetry of the flower. So if it's perfectly symmetric, which we'll call radial symmetry, then we call that a regular flower. If the petals are not all the same and it's not symmetric, or at least not radially symmetric, we call that an irregular flower. And in that case, it has what we'll call later bilateral symmetry, but not all the petals are the same. So all the petals the same, regular flower. Petals different in some way, irregular flower. So let me just show you a few of these sample flowers. I'm just going to run through a bunch. Take a look at this one. What do you see? I definitely see a female part and 5, it looks like, male parts, probably 6. Yeah, 6 male parts. So I'm thinking it is perfect because it has female and male parts. I see petals, and I think I also might see sepals. And also the fact that I see 6s here, based on 3s and 6, I could go back to what we said about monocot and dicot and predict that this is a monocot flower because it's divisible by 3. The flower parts are divisible by 3. So what's the ovary like in this one? It looks like that bulge is the ovary and the flower petals are on top of it. So that is an inferior ovary. And actually that's a cucumber. So you see the little cucumber is the ovary. That's what we keep saying. The fruit of the plant eventually will be the ovary, or the ovary eventually will be the fruit of the plant. And in this case, we can see it. It's a pickle or a cucumber. Now, that daylily that we keep talking about, it's kind of a trick because look what you see. I see 3 petals on top, but I also see what look like 6 petals. What you're really seeing, though, is in daylilies, the sepals look almost like the petals. So do you see that the 3 bottom petals there look similar? Those are actually 3 sepals, and on top I see 3 petals. So you still have flower parts of 3, but in this case, it's hard to see the sepals because the sepals look just like the petals. And so this has 3 petals, 3 sepals, and also 6 male parts and 1 female part you can see in the middle. So also it is a regular flower because all the petals are the same. It is perfect because we have both genders. And it's complete because we have sepals, petals, anthers, and pistil. Whoa, what's going on here? I think what I'm looking at is a flower that has a whole bunch of stamen, those anthers, the male parts, and it has a whole cluster of pistils in the middle. So it's definitely both genders in the same flower. I don't see petals or sepals though, so it's an imperfect flower. I'm sorry, it's a perfect flower. It is incomplete because it's missing petals and sepals, but it does have both genders present. The white things are the male parts, the greenish things in the middle are the female. And to make it easy, I could count the things in the middle. It looks like 6 pistils. So I think the flower parts are in groups of 3 or multiples of 3. That makes it a monocot. Yeah, here's a grass flower. You don't usually think of that as a flower, but in grasses, remember all of those little flowers that you're looking at, that big cluster of flowers, they don't have sepals or petals. And so all you're seeing are the anthers and the pistils, which means that it's an incomplete flower, and it's wind pollinated. You don't have to attract pollinators. Typical flower here. It looks like I see 5 pistils, and I don't think I see any male anthers in this particular one. I also see 5 petals, and if I turned it over, I might or might not see 5 sepals, but at least I'm missing the male parts. So this is an imperfect flower. It also makes it incomplete if you're missing the male parts. And multiples of 5 mean that I'm dealing with a dicot here. We'll look at the rest of these flowers the next time.